Welcome, everybody. It gives me great pleasure today to welcome you all for our ongoing series in the Middle East Institute, particularly with the political economy cluster. Today, um, I want to welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Jonathan Fulton, who's joining us here from Abu Dhabi from the Zayed University. Dr. Jonathan Fulton is an expert on relationships between China and the Middle East. He is the author of a recently published monograph titled China's Relationship, the Gulf Monarchy, with co-edit and also the co-editor of External Powers and the Gulf Monarchy. With that, I would hand over the floor to Dr. Fulton to talk to us about China and the Middle East. Thank
Thank,
you.
thank you, Amin, and really thanks to everybody here at MEI for getting me here. This is really a great opportunity. It's nice to be in Singapore. It's nice to not be in Abu Dhabi for a few days. It's really hot right now, and it's Ramadan, so we can't drink water in public, and we have to be hot and miserable. So it's great to be here, and I'm always happy to come back to Singapore. So, yeah, as Amin pointed out, I've been writing quite a bit about China and the Middle East. Mostly, I've been writing about China and the Gulf. I live in Abu Dhabi. I've been there somehow for 13 years now. I expected to be there for 3, and I just kind of got stuck. And it was kind of interesting for me because when I arrived, I thought I'd be in the Gulf for 3 years. I realized that I was going to go in a different track and start working as an academic. I retooled and did a master's degree in IR, and the focus was going to be how China's energy requirements shape its foreign policy. And what I really wanted to do was look at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and focus on Central Asia, and I thought this was a really kind of interesting topic. The deeper I got into it, the more I realized I actually lived right in the story, that the Gulf was really the issue of what China is doing for a lot of its energy security. And that kind of forced me to redirect my studies and start focusing more on the Middle East. So when I started doing my PhD, the topic was China-Gulf relations. And that's been really most of what I've been doing for the past 9 years or so. Now that the dissertation's done, the book is done, I'm kind of looking at more at the broader Middle East and doing more comparative stuff. So I think it's really interesting to say, how does it look at from North Africa, from the Levant, from these non-Arab places like Israel and Turkey and Iran. So the topic today, which I'm sure everybody saw in the posters, it's a little nod to Ray Carver, what Chinese leaders talk about when they talk about Middle East security. The reason I'm looking at this is that a lot of what we see with China Gulf specifically and China Middle East more broadly, the relationships are dominated by economic concerns. China's got a tremendous economic footprint in the region. This has led a lot of people to think that eventually they're going to have to change track and take a bigger role in securing this. So I want to look at this question a little more in a little more depth. I'm working on a paper. At this point, this doesn't qualify as political science. It's more analysis and description. But hopefully, after I get some good feedback from all of you and think about it a little more, then I'll have something that I can turn into a paper. Before I get into it, just a couple of points. I mean, obviously, I say obviously because this is what I work on all the time. I think we all understand that China's presence in the Middle East has really increased substantially in a pretty short period of time. When I moved to Abu Dhabi in 2006, the only Chinese people I ever saw in the city were the pirated DVD salespeople. There wasn't really a big Chinese presence. When I started the PhD in 2011, I remember talking to somebody from Mubadala, which is a sovereign wealth fund in Abu Dhabi, and saying, this is what I want to work on. And he just kind of like, there's nothing there. What are you going to research? There's nothing to work on yet. And by the time I finished and got the book out last summer, the book came out the same week Xi Jinping paid a state visit to Abu Dhabi. It was really either good timing or really smart on my part to publish a book the same week the president showed up to talk about my book topic. So it has been a much bigger presence for China in the Middle East. In recent years, we can see in terms of trade, which is how most of it is framed, last year, China-Middle East trade came up to $250 billion almost, which really blows a lot of us away when you look at it, because a lot of the narrative of China's economic footprint is that it's buying a lot of oil. And of course, it's much, much, much more than that. If you get out of the Gulf and you look at China, Middle East trade in general, the trade imbalance almost always favors China. It's selling a lot of stuff to Arab states or Middle Eastern states and not buying a whole lot. Now, this changes, of course, in the Gulf, where you get this trade imbalance that typically favors these energy exporters, but not completely. I mean, the UAE, where I live, always buys a lot more stuff from China than it sells to China, and it's a major energy supplier to China. It's this re-export hub of Jafsa, Jebel Ali in Dubai, where a lot of Chinese products are coming into Dubai and then going out to the rest of the Middle East and Africa and to Europe onwards. So they buy a lot of stuff in the Middle East from China. It's not really just a matter of oil for trade. It's a very deep and multifaceted trade relationship. But it's not just trade. We've seen investment, especially as the Belt and Road has become a bigger thing. We're starting to see a lot of these Chinese firms are playing a much bigger role in investment across the Middle East. Again, a lot of this is in the Gulf. Just this week, there's been stories out of Abu Dhabi that there's a potential $10 billion Chinese investment into this Khalifa port in Abu Dhabi. That's going to be a major thing. It's not getting a lot of notice yet, but this is a really big deal. And after the Belt and Road Forum last month, Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid from Dubai was in Beijing, and they announced a $4.3 billion investment into Dubai as well. So China's investing heavily in the Middle East, and it got to the point where in 2017 it became the biggest source of FDI into the Middle East, accounting for almost a third of the investment. And beyond that, there's just thousands of businesses and hundreds of thousands of Chinese expatriates all around the region. So it's a very big physical presence. In Dubai alone, I keep coming back to Dubai because it's kind of ground zero for China's trade networks in the Middle East. In Dubai alone, there's about 4,200 Chinese businesses. In Jebel Ali Free Zone, there's more than 230 companies that have set up a regional headquarters. And the reason, of course, is they're servicing contracts all over the Arabian Peninsula, all over the Middle East. But these CEOs don't want to live in Riyadh. They don't want to live in, a lot of other places. They want to live in Dubai where they can have some fun. So it's a much nicer environment. So you're seeing a big physical presence. I asked a Chinese diplomat recently, how many citizens do you have in the UAE? And he's like, I don't know. Can't keep track. I'd asked a Japanese diplomat the same question, and he had it down almost to the 10th. He's like, that's about 1,260, With China, we know there's more than 200,000 Chinese people in Dubai. We think there's more than 300,000. It's just an enormous population, and this goes way back. There's a really interesting study being done by a colleague in Sharjah named Wang Yu-Ting, and she's looking at second and third generation Chinatowns in Dubai. There's been these communities that have been there for quite a while. So again, this kind of begs the question: why? Why are all these Chinese setting up shop in the Middle East? This next slide doesn't really represent my perception. Obviously, I live in the Middle East, but typically when people think of Middle Eastern countries, it's not usually a very positive image, Especially in the last 10 years, we've seen a lot of political and economic instability. There is, if you look at the Fragile States Index, the most recent one from 2018, 9 of the top 25, I don't know if I'd say the top, but 9 of the 25 most unstable states or fragile states come from the broader Middle East. Images out of Syria, out of Palestine, out of Iraq, out of Libya kind of dominate our perceptions. And, when you get out of the Gulf and you get out of Turkey and Israel and you look at a lot of the Arab world, economically it doesn't really look that viable. Just looking at GDP per capita, you've got on the low end Yemen, and on the high end you've got Lebanon, and in between you don't have too many countries that are really performing economically very well. The UN Human Development Index typically places a lot of Middle Eastern countries pretty low. So again, why would Chinese companies and state-owned firms be so eager to come into this region where there's this perception of a lot of problems? And of course, this is just a one-sided view of it. I mean, where I live in Abu Dhabi, you're kind of confronted with a different reality on a daily basis. It's a very developed, very prosperous, very comfortable place. most of the time. For China, they look at the Middle East, it's crucial for their energy security. Obviously, this is a big part of it. More than 50% of their oil imports come from MENA. Most of that comes from the Gulf region. LNG is a big part of it as China tries to transition away from these coal-fueled electricity. They're looking towards making LNG a bigger part of their energy consumption. They just signed a 22-year deal with Qatar Gas to provide, I can't remember the numbers, but just a very substantial amount of LNG for the next 22 years. So energy is a part of it. And also the BRI, the Belt and Road, as this takes shape, you can't really get from Western China to the Mediterranean or Eastern Africa without passing through the middle. This Middle East is geostrategically a very important hub to get through it. You've got to pass through either the Red Sea or you've got to get through Iran and Turkey and parts of Iraq. Just geostrategically, it's a really important part of this initiative. And this initiative, I think in the past couple of years, we've kind of started to realize it's a real thing. When it was announced in 2013, a lot of the Western media especially really poo-pooed it and acted like, oh, it's got a funny name and nobody's going to want to partner with China because they're not transparent like us. And we've seen that narrative has changed quite a bit. It went from being basically ignored to being portrayed as a terrible threat with death trap diplomacy, and you can't trust these Chinese firms to deliver what they say they will, and be careful, don't go with them, come with us through the IMF because you've never had any trouble with them. So obviously the Belt and Road makes the Middle East a pretty important region for China. And again, just that there are so many Chinese folks who live there, so many Chinese businesses, means that they have to consider this strategically. They have to consider the security of this region as part of their larger Middle Eastern interests. So again, that begs the question, what kind of security role do we think we can expect to see China play in the Middle East? This is something none of us know. Everybody I talk to about this, we all are of different opinions. I'm no oracle, I don't know either, but I've given it a lot of thought, and as I said, I'm working on a paper for this. So hopefully, I can take this talk and turn it into something that maybe addresses it a little more analytically or more scientifically. So to get there, I'm going to first talk about the U.S. You can't talk about the Middle East without talking about the U.S. Can't talk about China without talking about the U.S. I went to Beijing in October. I was talking with a Chinese analyst. He focuses on Iran, and I just want to say, look, what do you think of this relationship with the UAE that was just signed? How's Iran going to feature into this? And every question I asked came back to Donald Trump. I should say out of the gate, I'm not from the U.S. I'm from Canada, so I don't have any special insight into Donald Trump, as if anybody really does. But he every question couldn't be just about China and the Gulf or China and the Middle East. It was always, well, we would do this if not for this third party, which kind of influences everything. So we kind of have to dig into what role the U.S. plays in the Middle East to really understand what China's trying to do. From that, I'm going to look at how China does things a little differently. What's China's approach to developing relations in the Middle East? Is there a difference between how it works or operates than how the U.S. does? Does it offer a different model, as many people hope or expect? And then I'm going to look at two competing visions of how China may approach a security role for the region. I'm sure there's more than two, but just for the purpose of this talk, there is a wide plurality of opinions, but just generally I can break it down into two general ones. And I know some of you have to leave early, so I'll tell you the two ideas are, there's one which is a kind of a traditional hard military approach, which you'd expect to be supported with things like bases and weapon sales and true presence and things like this. And then there's a second narrative, which is security through development. Pour money into problems and the problems will go away. I think many of us coming from a Western tradition would expect the first one to be the orthodox vision and the second one to be kind of the out and left field approach. But in China, it's actually the opposite. The idea of security as a result of development is the orthodox official view of how China is approaching these things. and those who are calling for a military approach to security are actually kind of on the outside to a degree. So, the first part, how does the U.S. feature? It is, of course, the elephant in the room. We can't avoid it. It seems, I guess, natural. The U.S. is seen as number one, and China's seen as number two. China's rising. It's perceived that America's declining. And because of this, we always compare them and say, well, is China going to do things the same way that America has? Or do they have a different model? Do they represent something new? A lot of folks, I'm a political scientist. I focus on international relations. A lot of realists would say that when you come down to your interest-based foreign policy, you're going to probably do things in a very similar way. That your interests would dictate that you have to build bases, you have to send troops over, you have to do things in a lot of the same way the U.S. has. But China's in a kind of an enviable position in the Middle East in that it doesn't have a lot of the baggage that Western countries do. Whether that means they'll do things differently is, who knows? But it does mean that it's kind of a blank slate that people can project any kind of hope or dream onto. China's going to offer us a new way of doing things. Again, maybe it will, maybe it won't. But I think it does have a pretty different approach to how the U.S. has done things. And we'll get into that just by looking at what the U.S. has typically done in the Middle East. Well, its interests, it's three core interests. I think you can boil it down to three things. Maintaining access to energy for global markets. Of course, the U.S. is largely sorted out its domestic consumption needs, but for its trading partners, for this liberal international order as it is, a lot of American allies need Gulf energy, so it's important that this stuff gets out to market, not necessarily for the U.S., but for Japan, for Korea, for other countries that America has very dense relationships with. Freedom of navigation is another core interest, passing through, again, this very important bit of real estate to reach different parts of the world is a very important interest for the U.S. in the Middle East in general, and the Gulf in particular. And of course, Israeli security is always going to be something that comes up when the U.S. thinks about the Middle East. How it has achieved these interests, or how it goes about achieving these interests, well, it's typically followed a balance of power logic throughout most of its time. For a long time, the U.S. was an offshore balancer in the Middle East in general, and in the Gulf in particular. It had token troops and stationed in parts of Saudi and Bahrain, not enough to really alter anything, really. It was a very, very small force of not many people at all. So it was an offshore balancer. Through the 70s, it had this twin pillars approach, whereby it supported its allies of Saudi and Iran. We'll work with you guys, and you maintain order, the order that we like, and the order that supports your states, your regimes. And it was able to do this really up until the Iranian Revolution, at which point the Carter Doctrine kicked in. This idea that if any external power tried to make inroads into the region, that the U.S. would repel them by any means necessary. Of course, this is targeted against the Soviet Union, but it was also targeted against regional powers, revisionist powers like Iran or Iraq, who might disrupt the status quo. So to this end, the U.S., after the Carter Doctrine in 1980, I guess it was announced, kind of signaled the end of this offshore business. It was going to be an active player in the Gulf. This is really more a declaration of aspirations, because again, it didn't have the means. Most Gulf states, or most Arab states, wanted to keep the U.S. at arm's length. This wasn't long after Camp David. The so-called Arab Street wasn't really happy about having a big American presence in their countries. So when the U.S. said we're going to start to build a bigger presence in the Middle East, yeah, with who? The only country that was really willing, other than Israel, was Oman, which has always been a little independent in its thinking, and signed a facilities access agreement with the states, which they used to try to rescue some of the hostages in Iran back in, I think it was 79 or 80. This made Oman quite an outlier in the region. A lot of states really didn't like that Oman was allowing the U.S. to go into Omani bases and upgrade them and base U.S. troops there. So it really kind of stayed, an offshore balancer throughout most of the 80s until the tanker war started to really kick up. And Gulf states realized they needed that the GCC as a mechanism wasn't going to be enough to repel Iraqi intentions or Iranian ambitions, that they would actually need some kind of external security provider. And the U.S. was, the one that everybody's most comfortable with. So, really wasn't until this point when Iraq invaded Kuwait. And this is the broad brushstroke history. I know that there are specialists here who would say I'm leaving a lot of stuff out, but it was after Iraq invaded Kuwait, and the U.S. went in and shortly afterwards signed these defense cooperation agreements with Kuwait, with Qatar, with the Emirates, and with Bahrain, and started building up these bases in a very large way, and supporting this with lots of troops and lots of hardware, that it finally became really an active balancer that had a real physical presence in the Gulf that would be enough to change the balance of power. What this has meant, there's a really good Chinese analyst at the Shanghai Institute of International, CISUS, Shanghai International Studies University, named Sundar Gang, and he does a lot of great comparative work on China, U.S., and the Middle East, looks at a lot of military stuff. And he's described the U.S. as a hard military presence. And by that he means the U.S. has gone into the Middle East largely for geopolitical ambitions, that there have been a set of core issues like anti-terrorism or non-proliferation or other kind of hard military issues that lead the U.S. to build this infrastructure to support its interests. In doing this, what we've seen is a kind of a Pax Americana throughout the Middle East. And I think this is kind of the view out of Washington is that America's creating this Pax Americana, but from the ground up, it kind of looks a little different. It doesn't look like there's much Pax within it. There's been a lot of turmoil in the region. There's been a lot of conflict. And the U.S. hasn't always been seen as the most reliable broker of maintaining this. But the one thing that's come of this, for my purposes and looking at this, is that these U.S. bases, these U.S. troops, this U.S. hardware has created this security umbrella, especially on the Arabian Peninsula, that guarantees a minimal security risk. Nobody really expects to see Iran, despite their adventurism in Fujairah a couple of weeks ago. Nobody would really expect to see Iran attack any GCC country, or Iran attack anybody, just because the costs would be too great. The American presence is a very effective deterrent. And what that has meant for other extra-regional states like China is that they know they can go into the Gulf, they can build up this big economic presence, they can set up their shops, they can bring over their multinationals, knowing that they're not going to have to pay the typical burdens of securing it, that the U.S. Security framework or security architecture is going to make sure that their citizens and their companies and their assets are going to be relatively safe. So it's not just China that's done this. I mean, if you look at almost every country, Japan, Korea, a lot of countries have been enjoying this opportunity to build a much bigger presence in the Gulf in particular, which is when Amin mentioned a book that I co-edited called External Powers in the Gulf. My colleague at Zayed is a NUS graduate named Li Chen Sim, and she's a Russia Middle East specialist. And we're just looking at what are different countries doing, what kind of strategies are they adopting. And we all saw the same thing, that countries are taking advantage of this opportunity to come in here, develop close ties to really every regional state. They're not privileging the GCC countries over Iran or vice versa. Everybody's just coming in and doing whatever they can get away with, which is a really nice kind of an opportunity that doesn't come up too often. So again, how this contrasts with what China's doing in the Middle East. Well, China's got some different interests. The first one, access to energy for global markets, well, they have the same thing. They want to see global markets getting the same type of affordable energy because they are the biggest exporter in the world. So they want all these countries to have a lot of money to buy Chinese stuff with. But unlike the U.S., it's also a matter of domestic consumption. As I said earlier, China relies on the Middle East for a lot of its energy supplies. So this is a matter of this is a core interest for China to maintain the flow of Middle East energy into China to help with their domestic economy, to help with their domestic development, to keep the Chinese Communist Party avoiding some of the legitimacy questions they might face if their economy is performing poorly. Freedom of navigation, the same. Obviously, with the Belt and Road, this is a even more important idea. There is nothing about Israel. It doesn't have anything like the same commitment to Israel. I think they see Israel as a great partner for high tech, ports, things like this, but they don't have anything similar to the U.S. commitment to defending Israel. But for the domestic economy, it's a much bigger issue for China than it is for the U.S. As I've indicated, the Middle East is a very big export market for China. They're selling a lot of light machinery. They're selling a lot of food and textiles. They're selling a lot of high tech. Huawei's moving in a big way. Satellite navigation. They're selling a lot of stuff in the Middle East. It's an important market. So, and they're also signing massive amounts of contracts. I don't know if you've been paying attention, but all of these, McKinsey seems to have one model that they're selling to everybody, Vision 20 something. Every country in the Middle East has a Vision 20 something, and Djibouti's got a Vision 20 something, and Kenya's got a Vision 20 something. And what most of these visions is build up a lot of infrastructure, pour money into building up the state and construction and stuff like this. Diversify your economies. Well, this is very, there's a great synergy between this and the Belt and Road. I mean, they're almost the exact same plans. It makes me wonder if McKinsey didn't write the Belt and Road Initiative for Xi Jinping, because it really looks like just a perfect confluence of interest in this. So really, when you look at this, China's interests in the Middle East and America's interests in the Middle East don't really diverge. There's not a lot of divergence here. There's a lot of things that they both want. The difference is, of course, that the U.S. has this military preponderance and its own vision, I guess, of leadership, and China doesn't have these same burdens or visions, and it also doesn't have the same approach. Whereas the U.S. is balanced, especially in the Gulf. You constantly see them through the 70s and 80s changing relationships, working with Iran and then working against Iraq and then working with Iraq against Iran, and it's just your head spins looking how quickly some of these things change. It's not that their feelings about these states has changed, it's that their interests have changed. Their interests have remained the same. It's just the means of achieving them have differed. You can't work with the Ayatollah, so I'll work with, Saddam kind of thing. Now, China doesn't balance at all in the Middle East. It doesn't balance in the Gulf. It's not balancing as a strategy requires you to target, a third party. You're working against somebody. You're working with one group of states or one state balancing against power, or you're balancing against a threat. This is really inconsistent with what China's doing. It's not going to balance. The other options would be to bandwagon on the regional, hegemon or preponderant power, which in this case would be the U.S., just to follow along and do whatever the U.S. does and support it. That also would not support China's interests. They can't just, hang Iran out to dry the way that the U.S. would prefer they do. Neutrality doesn't match the ambitions of a global power, just to say we're not going to make a decision here. What I think the best way to look at it is as strategic hedging, which is getting more attention from international relations literature in recent years. One of the first people to really look at it deeply is Evelyn Goh, who actually is, I believe, here, or she's in Singapore at least, and has written quite a bit about it. Basically, what strategic hedging is, it's an option for a state. It's going into a region where it has interests, and it's bumping up against a preponderant power or a hegemonic power. To challenge that power is going to, end badly. Balancing against any local actors also is going to end badly. You're going to alienate somebody. So instead, you go into this region. You try not to disrupt this ecosystem as much as you can. You work under the hegemonic or the preponderant power. You don't antagonize, you don't provoke, you don't do anything that's going to make them upset, and you make friends with everybody. You don't balance. You be friends with Iran, and you be friends with Saudi, and you be friends with Qatar, and you be friends with the Emirates. The way you be friends is mostly by demonstrating your utility as an economic actor, by saying, look, working with me pays these benefits. And again, this isn't just a strategy China's used. Russia and India and Japan and Korea, I would say, are also using the strategic hedging, where they're working with every country in the Gulf or every country in the Middle East. They're not targeting any one country that they won't work with, and they're building very dense relations, mostly on trade or investment. Issues like security or politics get put on the back burner because that's going to, cause friction or tension. So it's just much easier to develop ties through deep economic engagement. And as this intensifies, as it goes from, say, buying oil and selling cheap stuff to investment to financial, like, for example, Dubai's got 4 head offices of Chinese banks that are operating. They have a yuan or a renminbi clearance center that cleared some outrageous number of renminbi last year for different trade between China and the UAE. I think it was something like $7 billion, or it's $7 billion worth of renminbi that passed through the UAE and China just last year alone. So what they're doing is going from just trade to finance to investment to just a much more multifaceted, well-rounded economic presence. And with this, keeps advancing the relationship a little further, so they get to this point where they are, not just important economically, but they become very important politically as well. So the strategic hedging, I think, really explains a lot of what they've been doing. They've been taking advantage of this umbrella that America provides in developing a very well-rounded relationship with everybody. And one of the questions I keep getting asked is, how long can they do this? They're sitting on both sides of they've got to get off the fence. You can't be friends with Iran and Saudi at the same time. And China's like, what fence? There's no fence. America has a fence. We're just here doing business with our friends. It's telling that in 2016, when Xi Jinping made his first trip to the Middle East as president, he went to Saudi in January 2016, and they signed this comprehensive strategic partnership. It's another important tool that China uses. And this is the highest level of relationship that China confers on any other state. They don't do alliances. They do partnerships. The difference being that an alliance locks you down to certain commitments, whereas a partnership, just you both agree to work on areas of common interest and intensify the relations. And if there's something where you diverge, you just dissect it. You don't focus on that. You just focus on the things that you both share, and you build up the relationship on these core interests. So China signed this partnership agreement with Saudi, and everybody went, that's who they're going to side with. And then the very next day, he flew to Tehran and signed the exact same deal with Iran. And everybody's like, oh, they did it again. We never know what they're doing here. And to me, I thought, well, that makes perfect sense. Why would they choose? The relationship with Iran serves a purpose. The relationship with Saudi serves a purpose. I don't think they see the Gulf security environment the same way that Western countries or the U.S. sees it. So why would they have to behave in the same way? And this strategic partnership diplomacy, this is, I think, is a really, it's another really important thing to consider when they do this. I mean, the U.S. uses alliances, and these alliances mean that an alliance, again, is something that is inherently targeting a third party. I'm allied with you, Saudi, and the UAE against Iran, right? That limits really what the U.S. can do diplomatically in this region, because you just don't have the same kind of presence in Tehran. You don't have the same kind of relationships. I mean, if you look at the JCPOA negotiations, it took so much time for them to get to the point where the Americans and the Iranians could talk to each other. Like just that kind of trust building didn't exist because there've been decades of no contact. Whereas China, with their partnership diplomacy, being friends with everybody. When tensions got really badder between Saudi and Iran a year and a half ago, Wang Yi, the foreign minister of China, said, you know what, I can mediate because we're close to both sides. Both sides see us as an honest broker. We have deep interests with both sides, so you're not going to feel we're privileging one side over the other. And there aren't too many great powers that could make that same offer and be taken credibly or seriously. So this strategic partnership diplomacy, it's something I've written about a little bit. I had a paper in the POMEP study that came out a few months ago. I think it's a really interesting angle to how China's pursuing these relationships. And again, the fact that all of these Vision 20-something plans are coming, and they fit so nicely with what the the BRI is all about, means that they're able to really focus on areas of mutual interest to take the relationships to a much deeper level. Again, with Sun Dugong. Sun's a great guy. Nice gentleman and a scholar. He draws the contrast with the U.S. He says China, whereas the U.S. has this hard military presence, China has a soft one. The reason it has a soft one is it's mission-oriented. It's not focused on maintaining a presence. It's focused on having a military that's able to do things like these anti-piracy missions in the Gulf of Aden, or whether it's something like peacekeeping in Lebanon, or evacuating citizens out of Yemen. Again, it's mission oriented, which means they don't have to have bases and troops to pull it off. They can go in and get out easily. They don't need the hardware. And the reason why they do this is, again, it doesn't have the same kind of political motivation or the strategic motivation that the U.S. has had. It's mostly economic motivation. When China looks at these markets, they think, okay, we need energy, we need to focus on domestic development. Again, this China dream for 2049 for China to be a fully developed modern state. This needs, again, a long period of stability, tranquility, not adventurism. So, build up these regions that are important trading partners economically, and focus on economic outcomes rather than political or military outcomes. So the big difference here is that they've got different goals, and these different goals require different approaches. They don't necessarily have different interests. It's not a matter of they just can't see eye to eye on what they expect out of the Middle East. They're just trying to engage it with it for different purposes, with different means. So what I'll come to now is what these Chinese approaches actually are. How these different visions or these approaches play out. So as I said, there's two general narratives, and these slides I have to apologize. I'm terrible with PowerPoint, as no doubt you can tell. I would have changed this quite a bit. Some of the language is kind of sloppy, and there's typos and things. But when I saw this, I thought I didn't really like the second point under traditional hard power. These idea of norms and self-perceptions of China's international role. I think it's kind of an awkward phrasing, but generally what I mean by this is that a lot of the stories Chinese people and Chinese leaders kind of tell themselves about their role internationally is framed under these principles of peaceful coexistence. We don't interfere in other countries' domestic policies. We kind of stay out of that stuff. We're win-win development. It's always framed in very positive narratives, right? And this idea of a traditional hard power approach to security, of building bases, of developing alliances, of sending troops into these places and keeping them posted there, well, that's a challenge to this kind of narrative of peaceful coexistence and non-interference. And for that, it's kind of the outside narrative. Now, by outside, I just mean it's not the official government. It's not what you hear government officials saying. When you read policy documents, it doesn't talk about this stuff. The people who do advocate for this typically are very influential mainstream thinkers. It's just what they're pushing for is not something that you would normally see the government make into policy. The second one, this idea of security of development, well, this reaffirms these ideas of what China does internationally. It doesn't go into other countries and dictate terms. It doesn't attach strings to development or trade. It doesn't say, yeah, we'll give you this money if blah, blah, blah. Like you've got to use very transparent, open bidding contracts to build this road. Here's the money, build the road. I don't care if your brother builds it, your cousin builds it, if you build it yourself, just build it, So there's this idea of security of development, because it's not about this hard presence, it's not about this, sending troops into these places. It kind of conforms to how this preferred way of seeing China's involvement in other countries, and that's why it's more of the official narrative. So, just a couple of minutes of each one. I pulled just some statements from some prominent thinkers for the traditional hard power narrative. I looked at a couple of IR profs. Shen Dongli is at Fudan University. So when I say outsider, clearly this isn't on the outside. Fudan is one of the most preeminent IR programs in the country, and Dr. Shen is a very well-known and very well-respected academic. I just say outside because, again, he's been calling for a while for a different approach to the way China's done things. And I think this goes back to this Taoguan Yanghui idea of hide and bide, that China's kind of approach its international relations since Deng Xiaoping, you know, hide your capabilities and bide your time. Shen was writing in 2010 saying, look, this idea of not having bases overseas is actually a problem. Like, we have to start thinking differently about this. We have to stop hiding and biding and start being a little more active. Not that I really think hiding and biding is a very accurate description of what happened. I used to live in Taiwan, which is where I became interested in China. And when I lived in Taiwan, it certainly never felt like Beijing was hiding or biding by any means. But I think it's a pretty good shorthand for this strategy that existed during the era of reform. So what Shen was arguing was, yeah, we need bases. We need to project power. The reason why we need to do this is because we have interests all over the place now. We've got overseas businesses, we've got assets, we've got investments, and we've got citizens. We have to be able to protect those things. So he wrote this very kind of interestingly received article in 2010 advocating for this. His argument was with the continuous expansion of China's overseas business, the government, again, terrible slides, the government is more accountable for protecting the overseas interests. It's actually got to step up. You can't rely on the U.S. to patrol shipping lanes and create this stable atmosphere for us forever. We've got skin in the game. We've got to get involved here. And he gave a little more details. He said, any state's got responsibilities for these things. And if China did create these bases overseas, the things we'd see would be that Chinese citizens and wealth would be protected. Trade would be guaranteed. We wouldn't have to worry about our shipping lanes being cut off by an angry adversary. We wouldn't have to worry about external intervention in key trading partners, things like the U.S. going into Iran and starting a war, for example, and defense against foreign invasion. So he was calling for this in 2010. And at the time, this was not something you really saw a lot of, because it was still considered taboo almost to say, look, we should, what could be more invasive into another country's domestic affairs than to put a military base there, right? But we've seen this, obviously with Djibouti, this base that was created, the People Liberation Army supply base in Djibouti that China built. And it's interesting, I was at a conference at East China Normal University last year, and a British academic gave a really interesting paper on Djibouti. He'd spent a lot of time in the Horn and he'd done a lot of field work. And when he's presenting, he finished his paper, and a Chinese academic who was at the conference stood up and very angrily denounced his classification of this as a base. This isn't a base. This is there to support our commercial endeavors. It has no military utility whatsoever. That's not what we do. Everybody knew it was a base, but he had to say it, right? It seemed like you just had to stick up for the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, I guess. So we have seen that this particular norm has already changed a little bit. Another prominent thinker, Yan Shuitong, is one of the top IR scholars. He's at Tsinghua University. Really great scholar. I really recommend checking out his work if you're interested in Chinese IR. He also kind of took aim at an orthodoxy, which is the non-alignment policy, which China adopted in 1982. And there's a lot of reasons why a country wouldn't want to make alliances. Some of the fundamental work on alliances and the security dilemma is that the stronger power has to worry about the fear of entanglement, that you're going to get caught up in somebody else's conflict that you don't want any part of. And the weaker side always has this fear of abandonment, that maybe the stronger state's going to leave me, So the relationship's always kind of fraught with this tension. For China, I think it's the fear of entrapment. Just as this very large country, why commit militarily to other countries when they can drag you into their messy fights? Again, strategic partnerships rather than alliances. What Dr. Yan was arguing is, if we do this, we're always going to be seen as a little less reliable than an ally. And this has been confirmed when I talk to Emirati academics or officials and say, could you take China as seriously as you take the US without an alliance commitment? And the answer is always a resounding laugh, like, of course not. China right now is in the future maybe, but right now, because they don't have the same skin in the game that the US does, we're just not going to take them as seriously. There has to be more than just trade or economics. And of course, in a regional security complex like the Gulf, that's always going to be a concern. So for Yan, this is part of the problem, is that you're not going to get the best friends when you're just strategic partners, unless you pursue alliances, then you're going to always be seen as kind of a second tier partner. And he says, again, he draws this distinction between how China had to operate during the reform era when it wasn't really a very powerful country compared to how it is now. He says non-alignment suited our country during the Cold War when it was weak. However, in the coming decade, China will no longer be the weak country it was. To stick to the non-aligned strategy would not only be unhelpful, but also potentially harmful. And by harmful, he just means, look, countries are not going to take us seriously. So we have to, express our commitment more deeply. So both of these, and I could go into many more but I keep looking at the clock. These two thinkers represent this, with what an IR scholar would say, a more realist approach to things, right? It's a recognition that the Taoguan Yanghui, the Heidenbide, doesn't really reflect what China needs to be doing at a period where, Xi Jinping's, be proactive in seeking achievement seems to be the new foreign policy mantra. And we've seen this with the PLA base in Djibouti. We might see this in Gwadar, who knows? But there is a chance that there is a lot of diversity in thinking. But for now, this still remains academic because beyond Djibouti, there hasn't been any other talk of another base being developed. And there aren't really too many countries that would make a logical choice. We do see some very small steps toward this in the Middle East. Again, most of my work is on the Gulf, and I'm seeing this in the Gulf a little more. When they signed these strategic, comprehensive strategic partnership agreements with Saudi and the UAE, there was a section on security cooperation, and it talked about things like weapon sales, and it talked about things like joint training exercises, counterterrorism training. The People Liberation Army and Navy has been making port of calls in lots of different ports around the Arabian Peninsula for a while now. So they're slowly going in a more militarized approach, but baby steps. I mean, by weapons sales, it's mostly stuff that the U.S. won't sell. Saudi needs ballistic weapons, and the U.S. Congress says no. China says yes. The U.S. Congress says we're not going to sell drones. China sets up a drone factory in Saudi and sells them to everybody in the Middle East who wants them. So it's taking baby steps, but they're still, it's still at an early stage. And a big part of this, again, is because of the U.S. There's resistance both on the side of the Chinese who don't want to antagonize America in the Middle East. Again, this Carter Doctrine, America hasn't said no more Carter Doctrine. If China looks like it's building a presence that could possibly challenge this preponderance, then that would trigger a response, right? So they don't want to do this. More importantly, I think a lot of Arab states also don't want to do this. What is the benefit of saying to China, yeah, come in here and build a base, knowing that this is just going to make everybody in Washington go crazy, and it's going to sever the relationship? We're seeing this with Israel right now, where Costco has signed this deal to develop Haifa Port, and Pompeo, Secretary of State Pompeo and John Bolton are constantly haranguing Israeli officials saying, if you do this, and if you let Huawei into Israel, you can't expect us to have the same kind of presence because this is going to challenge our core security interests. So I think for a lot of Middle Eastern states, for now, everybody's happy hedging. Why let China develop its presence slowly? There's going to come a time when it changes. For now, keep everything on the down low so it's not going to kind of disrupt this already very fragile, unstable region. Almost done, I promise. And that's with the securities development narrative. That is this idea of the military doesn't provide security, development provides security. And this is consistent, again, with these norms of the five principles of peaceful coexistence. It's consistent with the geoeconomic approach that my friend Dr. Soon has talked about. It's consistent with strategic hedging, where you don't alienate anybody. And it's also consistent with a lot of these official statements and the vision and action document, which outlines the Belt and Road Initiative and how China wants to develop it. A couple of quotes. The former Minister Wang Yi, when it was asked about China's security role in the Middle East, said, you know, we believe that development holds the key and serves as the foundation for solving all problems. Any solution to hotspot and political issues hinges on economic growth and better lives for the people. As far as Arab countries are concerned, the most crucial task facing them is national development and economic revitalization. Another shorter quote came from Li Chongwen, who's the ambassador, the permanent representative to the China Arab States Cooperation Forum. When he was asked about security issues, he very succinctly said, the root problems in the Middle East lie in development, and the only solution is also development. And I've seen this many times. I saw a very brave Chinese scholar trying to explain why China used a veto in the UN on Syria in Doha. So a room full of Arab people who were very angry about this decision. She tried to explain it, and she took a real flogging for it. But at one point, another Chinese, more senior scholar said, what do you want? A military adventurism looks like Iraq. Is that what you want? Do you want us to go in there with our military and start breaking things with the military? Like, it's not going to fix anything. So this is a really deeply held belief, I think, that, you know, you're going to get a lot more through development than you're going to be with going in with tanks and soldiers. The China Air Policy paper also focuses on development rather than military solutions. And I mentioned a second ago the vision and action document about the Belt and Road, which is something the Chinese government's, the white paper for the Belt and Road was announced in 2015, and it focuses on cooperation priorities. Nowhere in this document does it talk about security, you know, military cooperation. It says let's focus on things like policy coordination and unimpeded trade and infrastructure or facilities connectivity and financial integration and people-to-people bonds. So their approach to this is still very economics driven, and I think that's a strategic choice. It just makes it easier. We saw this in action last July. The China Arab States Cooperation Forum had its a meeting that it holds every 2 years, a ministers' meeting. This drew a lot of recognition because the Chinese government committed to $23 billion in aid and loans and investments into the Middle East. This breaks down to $20 billion for reconstruction, $3 billion in special loans for financial sector, money for social stability, humanitarian aid. You know, nothing like money going into building special forces or buying hardware. You know, it's all fix your problems. So I'll wrap it up here. Which of the two is more likely to win out in the long term? I have no idea. I mean, security development fits into a lot of the ways that China talks about international politics. It's more consistent, again, with a lot of these principles and norms. I think it's also consistent with how they want to act in an especially tense period between the US and China. You know, the way things have gone in the past, how many months has it been now? You know, this Thucydides trap narrative, which only 2 years ago, I think, when the book came out, seemed quite outrageous to most people, and now it seems really quite spot on with how the relationship is going. This idea that as a rising power grows, you know, the existing power is going to challenge them. It'll lead to a war. You know, I would have thought that was crazy talk not long ago, and now it seems not really so far from what we'd expect. So I think in this case, they would continue to not really push a whole lot in the Middle East, to keep focusing on this economic approach to the relationship. As you can see, why ruin a good thing? If you can keep doing this at no cost, really, if you don't have to patrol the shipping lanes, you don't have to, you know, protect your citizens, and, you know, keep enjoying it. But that's hard to say, because as this power redistribution is taking place, it's going to lead to a lot of shifts in the international order. There's going to be a lot of new strategic realities that we haven't even really thought of yet that are going to confront us as America's relative power changes, as China's relative power increases, and as this starts to take shape across Asia especially, but across Eurasia, there's going to be a lot of new things that we haven't really built into our thinking yet. And the BRI is going to have some unintended consequences too. And I can think of all these flashpoints in the Middle East where the BRI could lead to something. The one that I think of often is Gwadar in Pakistan, where, again, this is a really great opportunity for Pakistan to address a lot of its developmental issues. Recently, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman visited Pakistan, announced that Saudi would also like to start investing in this. The Chinese response wasn't overjoyed. It was kind of muted. And I'm not surprised because, Gwadar is in Baluchistan, which is a contested territory in Pakistan. It's not the most stable area, and it also spills over into Iran. So it could be perceived that maybe Saudi's deeper investment in Gwadar could actually be seen as a way to counter Iran, which would politicize China's initiative, which could lead to one of these unintended consequences. So I'm going to leave here. I'm sorry I went a little longer than I think I should have, but I'll stop now. Thanks.